Well, good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. By now you know me. I hope I do not tire you. Welcome. We want to continue our discussion about all things China this morning. The title of this panel is China's Belt and Road in the post-COVID-19 era. Let me briefly emphasize post-COVID-19 era with regard to China in light of the developments in Shanghai and Shenzhen. The lockdowns there appears a rather premature statement right now. I have two guests, panelists, who have joined me, experts on the subject matter. I'm happy that they have traveled all the way from the United States. And Philippe, whom I know, welcome back. Good to see both of you. Philippe is a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Paul Stronski is equally associated with the Carnegie Endowment. He's a senior fellow. He focuses very much on Russia and Eurasia. I would like to first ask Philippe the following. Given that we're focusing on the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, it is currently the single largest geo-economic initiative. It involves approximately 140 countries. Philippe, in light of the war in Ukraine, what implications can we start to identify for the further development of the Belt and Road Initiative? It has undergone changes in the past years since it was inaugurated in 2013. COVID-19 has impacted. Now comes the war. What are the first consequences that we can identify, Philippe?
Jens, thank you very much. Delighted to be back in Delphi. I think it's my 5th time. I think to answer your question, one needs to go back to the origins of the Belt and Road, which was launched in 2013, with of course the northern routes, including across Russia and Central Asia, including the China-Pakistan corridor, and the routes leading to, not to Delphi, but to Athens. All roads lead to Athens, as we know, but the maritime route, which is not too badly affected. And I say too badly because obviously you've mentioned the lockdown, 26 million people locked down in Shanghai. I think this has never been seen. Indeed. I mean, Wuhan is less than that. Yep. And then you've got Shenzhen, neighboring Hong Kong. This is a very serious situation. I think the zero COVID policy of Mr. Xi is under great threat from a Chinese point of view as well. But back to your point, obviously the war in Ukraine is by far the most disturbing element to the Belt and Road project. Why? Because, well, originally, of course, Russia was going to be a close partner to China on this. So was Ukraine. Ukraine, as you know, has had diplomatic relations with China for the past 30 years.
And good economic relations.
Yes, and they kind of congratulated each other back in January, on this achievement. And then the war came. So what's going to happen to some of these projects is hard to tell now, because the BRI, China, as we heard before, is a pragmatic country. I agree with Susan Thornton on this. And the Belt and Road has not been top of the news for the past 2 years. The pandemic, of course, is critical. And now the geopolitical situation, which somewhat includes the BRI. It's a dimension. People call it the geoeconomic. I think you've called it geoeconomic because you've written on this a lot as well. So, I mean, the thing to remember is that 80% of world trade goes via the maritime routes. Yeah. That will continue now. But the lockdown should not be excluded from this conversation, considering that shipping will be affected. Yeah. Ports are being affected already. They've been affected for the past 2 years. So on one hand, you've got a war up there with some routes that were part of the Belt and Road, which are no longer in use. On the other hand, you've got the maritime problem with so much of the trade that's not being able to be delivered, or that will really affect global trade. So, at the same time, it's true that the Belt and Road is a major plan. There is no equivalence. The Europeans have launched the Global Gateway. The Americans have their own project, the Japanese. Yeah. But as in terms of how far ahead they are, of course, the Chinese project was advanced, but will be badly affected by the situation.
I agree with you regarding this point. All the other initiatives that you've just mentioned, in a way, they're playing catch-up. They're 10 years behind the curve about that. And the Belt and Road Initiative has, in the past years, also gone some rhetorical change. Sometimes it's been supplemented by the term, in light of the pandemic, Health Silk Road. We'll come back to that. Paul, I'm sorry. Paul, could the Belt and Road, and Philippe was already alluding to it, could the Belt and Road be or become collateral damage of the war in Ukraine? As Philippe has just mentioned, ports are impaired in the Black Sea. The Black Sea for navigation in terms of floating mines is an increasing danger for other countries, including Greece, for example, who had to partly take their fleet away from that region. Ports are closed. Land-based railway routes are not operational right now. What's the state of play? How do we move forward on that?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm really great to be here in Delphi. I would agree, in many ways with Philippe. This has been a major project for Eurasia as a whole. It's been a major project for Russia, but not only Russia. It's been a major project for Russia's neighbors, whether that is in Central Asia, whether that is in Ukraine, or whether that is the Caucasus and parts of Eastern Europe. And many of these countries, Georgia, for example, Ukraine, they saw this not just as an economic project, but they also saw this as a way to hedge, a way to protect themselves, both caught between Russia and the West. China was another option. And what we're seeing now is that both because of China's strong diplomatic backing of Russia, we're seeing that maneuvering ability be curtailed. On the railway front, just about $75 billion worth of goods, supposedly, if you look at some Chinese figures, supposedly transited those railways that go from Kazakhstan to Russia, into Belarus, and then into the European Union. That all has stopped. The first few weeks of the war, things continued because they were already in place. But what we saw was first sanctions against the Russian railway company, which recently, last week, defaulted on its debt. We are seeing global shipping operators just pulled out of Russia. They don't want to do it. They're also pulling out of Ukraine because of the security issues. We are seeing the insurers of cargo also back out of these three countries. And then another aspect is both sort of the importers in Europe as well as the exporters in China. China might have pivoted diplomatically to help Russia, but many on the enterprise level in China are very nervous about these sanctions, and they do not want their goods traveling through Russia because the EU is a much more important market for Chinese exports, and the United States is a more important market for Chinese exports. So what we have seen really is all of this focus on these train and rail routes and road routes that run from Central Asia through Russia has basically collapsed.
It's an interesting point that you address that, because I think it's often underestimated. For example, the provision of trade finance or insurance provisions by banks, by insurance companies right now is severely impaired along certain parts of the Belt and Road Initiative, land connectivity in particular. Philippe, would you like to add to that?
Well, yeah. And so the question is, I mean, what's going to happen to these northern boots? What I found really interesting, which Paul could have mentioned because he knows Eurasia very well, is the Kazakh statement of basically supporting Ukraine's independence. I wish China was doing it more often. Yeah. They are actually making a point that Kazakhstan, the largest, one of the largest with Uzbekistan countries in Central Asia, will not go along the aggression of Ukraine, which means they're also preserving their relations with China. Yeah. But surely the train operation that goes through Kazakhstan is also in deep trouble, and it's a major part of Horgoz, the dry port of Horgoz, is in which I visited a couple of years ago, is in deep trouble because of this. So overall, I would say that the Belt and Road is suddenly becoming sort of backstage, and we hear there are things going on in Latin America or in Africa, but certainly the core center, the geopolitical center of the world now is well, there are two. Perhaps there's the Indo-Pacific, and there's the Ukraine and this part of Northern Europe.
Kazakhstan, I find interesting that you highlighted for a moment, because indeed there is this statement with regard to the respect of sovereignty, of territorial integrity of Ukraine. And a few weeks ago, they received themselves military assistance, which they urgently needed, Paul, from Russia.
Well, what I think is interesting about Kazakhstan, I think you could also, Uzbekistan has also has not followed Russia in acknowledging the independence of these separatists, these breakaway regions, or these occupied regions, whether that's Crimea or eastern Ukraine. So we're seeing some of Russia's far weaker neighbors actually break with Russia in ways in which China has not. But I think this is the impact of sort of this collapse in rail through sort of the northern route is deeply troubling for a country like Kazakhstan. It has been betting its economy on being a transit hub, a railway transit hub. It was supposed to be the bridge between Europe and Asia. And it's a country that has, both with energy transition, both because of COVID, it has had some stability problems. It basically just had a bottom-up combined with top-down elite change, in which the Russians proved definitive in helping the current president remain in power. But what I think this shows is both Kazakhstan in many ways is very similar to Russia. There's a large Russian population, Russian-speaking population. Russia has territorial claims against Kazakhstan. And this new this president, Mr. Tokayev, is pretty shrewd. I mean, he seems to have used Russia to sort of keep himself in power, but then not only has he continued to recognize Ukrainian territorial integrity, but he refused a Russian request to send troops just weeks after troops were sent to help him. So I think he's really pushing back. But I do think for a country like Kazakhstan and a country like Central Asia, they are going to be really feeling this war, both because their economy is closely tied to the Russian economy. So sanctions, although they are not sanctions, they're getting the bubble-on effects of sanctions. Migrant laborers are coming back, and now the Belt and Road is not as sure a bet as it was before. So what we've seen just in the last few weeks is Kazakhstan has been talking with Azerbaijan, it's been talking with Georgia about trying to revitalize a southern route across the Caspian. It's been talking with Turkmenistan to try to figure out other ways to get to remain a transit hub. But it's particularly for a country like that, it's quite worrying to see what's happening.
I agree with your point there. Many of these countries in that region have structured their infrastructure investments precisely on defining themselves as a gateway or transit hub towards Europe. And with that, Philippe, I want to come to aspects that are closer to Western Europe, the European Union. Last week we had the EU-China summit. First one since 2 years, again virtual. There were warnings expressed before and during the summit from, for example, Ursula von der Leyen about major reputational damage for China if it follows a policy regarding support, material support to Russia in a variety of areas. First of all, what do you make of the summit? Because, as I mentioned in the previous panel, a major representative, Mr. Borrell from the EU, has called it a summit of the deaf. Was it really a deaf? Is somebody missing a message? What do you take away from it?
So the Europeans had low expectations for this summit, and quite rightly. What they got from Mr. Xi apparently was he said China was going to call for a peace resolution of the Ukraine conflict in its own way, which means, as we heard previously, it's going to continue to support Russia openly, and possibly will try to help Chinese companies, of course, not to be victims of these Russian sanctions, which is, of course, a major issue, because at the end of the day, the Chinese economy, is slowing down, and it's not the country is not in the shape it was in a few years ago. And secondly, there's this question that China that you asked to the previous speaker, that China might or not become a mediator. I don't think he wants to play that role, and I don't think it's got the expertise to do this, to be honest. In terms of the European diplomacy, I think they've made their points pretty clearly. For once, Europe has never been so unified as it is now. You could even say that it's reinforced a transatlantic dialogue on China, which was not really happening. Now, of course, we've got Viktor Orban re-elected over the weekend. That's not necessarily a good thing in terms of the European unity vis-à-vis a number of geopolitical issues. But certainly, I think the EU made their points. China did not want to discuss Ukraine. No. And I think, China does not realize how serious the situation is. So the pictures coming out from this terrible massacre of Bucha are starting to circulate in China itself. There have been interesting comparisons with the Nanjing massacre in some of the social media comments, which I suppose speaks to the Chinese about their own history. But in terms of the reactions in Europe and the negative impact that China's position stands on this could have on its reputation in Europe, I think this is actually getting quite serious. And when you add human rights issues, when you add the pandemic, the lack of transparency around the pandemic, and then China's stance on Ukraine, there's quite a lot of problems to explain to the European people, which is already very stressed by all this. So I think it's time for diplomacy, but it's also time to put oneself in the other person's shoes.
Paul, this sense of unity, urgency of purpose, I agree with that, what Philippe just said. But did it need a war in Europe to achieve that?
It certainly seems to be that way, unfortunately. I mean, I think, I saw this all sort of running up from having been a former government official in the Obama administration during the 2014, the initial 2014 war. I think there was a much bigger disconnect between Europe and the United States, and Europe and Canada as well, Europe and North America, over Ukraine. And I think whether that was on sanctions, whether that was on whether you could re-engage or not, whether you can have yet one more reset with Russia, And I think even in the run-up, when the United States was sharing information about what it knew or what it thought might happen, I think we really didn't see that unity until the invasion actually started. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you saw a deep pivot. And then, once again, when the real horror of what's going on in Ukraine gets known, Bucha, the bombing of Mariupol, that seems to be when you can get sort of that unity once again. In the United States, particularly in Washington right now, it is a very anti-Russian mood. You see Ukrainian flags all over the place. Yeah. And there is rare in the United States in this era where there is large bipartisan understanding that this is an area where we need to cooperate and we need to work with Europe. However, I wonder in the long term how much this unity will last, both because we see political elites and the people who are interested in foreign policy. Yeah. They're focusing on this. People interested in Ukraine and European security are focused in on this. But the average population, when the horror is front and center, yes, you're very upset about it. But when you go to fill your petrol tank, you also get very upset about that as well. And so I think, particularly as this war goes on, and I think I sadly think the worst is still ahead of us with Ukraine. It's going to be harder for both societies to remain unified with these policies, as well as various governments. And then we have uncertainty, both the U.S. elections, we have the French elections coming up, lots of uncertainty in how this will play out on the political level as well.
Philippe, with regard to the China-EU summit, they didn't want to talk about Ukraine. But there is an agreement between China and the European Union called the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. It's stalled or frozen in the European Parliament. Do you see any way forward to unfreeze it from one or possibly from both sides?
No.
No.
I think this was on top of the agenda on the Chinese side. Yeah. And as you know, the story is that Mrs. Merkel pushed for that agreement to be signed at the end of 2020, at the end of her presidency of the European Council. This was an achievement as far as she was concerned. A fairly poor timing, I would say, but from a European business point of view, it wasn't all bad, far from that. The problem is, of course, there were sanctions first against Chinese officials with regard to the situation in Xinjiang, followed by a long list of sanctions from China against all kinds of people, including members of European parliaments, who are themselves the ones to vote for the ratification of this agreement. And therefore, there's no way, this parliament, which is in office until 2024, as far as I know, the next European Parliament election, is going to lift sanctions if they are banned themselves. So that's a problem. And honestly, I think again, back to Ukraine, I think that the general geopolitical context means that, as Mrs. von der Leyen said, we cannot go, business as usual. No. Yeah. This time is over. There's a war in Europe, and we cannot have a sort of bilateral discussion as was planned. Discussing sort of trade issues and in fact, one issue which we haven't mentioned yet is Lithuania, which has opened an office in Taiwan, which is something pretty common for a foreign country to do. And there have been sanctions against Lithuania and against companies dealing, trading with Lithuania. So this is, of course, something that the Europeans wanted to put on the table as well, and that was addressed by the EU representatives during the summit. And in fact, there's also a case before WTO that's been brought forward by the EU. That will take a long time, of course, but to express the EU's support with this situation, with one of its key members.
We'll return to the issue of Lithuania and the so-called 16+1, formerly 17+1, in a moment. Paul, I'd like to come back to an issue that we addressed in the previous panel. It concerns the Sino-Russian relationship, a very personal relationship between President Putin and Xi Jinping. There's chemistry there on both sides. What I'm asking myself and you now is, but how deep is that relationship if we take away for a moment both political leaders in terms of the deepness, society to society, economy to economy, nation state to nation state? Are there also no limits there, or do we actually see the opposite?
I think we see the opposite. I think you certainly see limits. Russia has, for a long time, just like the United States has pivoted to Asia, Russia numerous times since Peter the Great has pivoted to Asia and pivoted to China over history. But it's very much been a rhetorical pivot. Russians still see themselves as part of Europe. Their engagement with Europe, that's where the bulk of their economy and their trade has been. And so the Russian psyche, when they think about going overseas, they think about coming to Greece. They think about going to, that's where they're putting their money. They're sending their children, or at least the Russian elite, when they still could, were sending their children to European and North American schools and universities. You do not see as many people eager to send their children to China. And I would say that's the same in China. You don't see a whole lot of wealthy Chinese parents wanting their children to study in Russia. Where do they want to study? It's usually the United States, Australia, and Europe. And so you see these both countries, the markets of North America and the markets of Europe and other parts of Asia are way more important to China. And that's why, although this is a partnership with no limits, as Mr. Xi said, we are seeing individual Chinese companies, including some state-owned companies, actually abide by the sanctions regime because they do not want to be caught in the crossfire of European anger. So they might not be pulling out of Russia, but we're seeing this both in the investment into new projects, particularly in the oil and gas, investment in new infrastructure projects, and even in investment in, Russia is trying to sell its oil and gas to China at deep discounts. And we've seen just yesterday, Chinese state companies have decided not to do new contracts. And I think that indicates that while on the political level, there might be no limits, on the commercial level and on the diplomatic, the people-to-people level, there certainly is. And I think if you go to parts of the Russian Far East, there is actually a huge xenophobia there. They feel that although there's not a very large Chinese presence in the Russian Far East, they see a far more dynamic economy. And they are not benefiting from it. And there is all sorts of conspiracy theories against the Chinese that are running around, particularly among some of the same groups of people who are backing Russian nationalism and Russia's efforts to reassert itself. And then in other parts of the globe, Central Asia, the two countries do bump into each other occasionally. So it's quite a complex situation. And I think Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin paper over some of those differences.
It's interesting that you mentioned the non-renewal of these energy contracts. That could also be a sign that secondary sanctions, although not yet notified, actually already working, because you possibly are anticipating them. Yeah.
No, I think that's very much the case, and we are seeing this both. I think if you look at the rail, going back to BRI, if you look at the rail transport, that has collapsed not just because of the transportation companies, but it's collapsed because nobody wants to put their commerce on a train that goes through Russia or Ukraine right now. And so we are seeing the war have other impacts. And I think another thing we could talk about is the BRI in Ukraine, because that's also very, very much unknown. I can connect it a little bit with Lithuania as well. Over the past year, we've really seen a lot more interest of the Chinese in Ukraine, simply because there's huge needs for infrastructure. It's part of the BRI. They had just a month ago, they had we're talking about their 30 years of great diplomatic relations. Ukraine President Zelensky called Ukraine also a bridge to Europe for the Chinese as well, just a few months ago. And all of that has seemingly gone nowhere. And the Chinese were also looking at Ukraine. Because of the problems with Lithuania, many of those railways end up in Lithuania that go through Russia and Belarus. But also sanctions a year ago against Belarus made it that much more complicated. So Ukraine was supposed to be a new route that the Chinese were going to take advantage of. And that is very much up in doubt right now.
Ukraine and Russia are the two most important wheat exporters for China. In particular over maritime routes. We'll come back to that in a moment. Philippe, because you mentioned Lithuania, and in connection with the opening of the representative office in Vilnius, that is part of a larger debate regarding what is called the 16+1 network, which China has established with mainly countries from Central and Eastern Europe. Now, what is the future of this network? Because the first country has left, Lithuania. Secondly, there are a number of countries whose governments, Poland, the Czech Republic, have mentioned a certain level of disillusionment, of the return on investment, what we took there is actually not materializing on the ground. Could you expect other countries to leave? And what are the prospects of such a network in which many countries initially invested quite a lot of political capital at great risk?
Absolutely, including Greece. Well, actually, this was set up, as you say, as the 16+1, as a sort of geopolitical tool to try to counterbalance the European Union and to create somewhat a state within the state, a sub-EU, perhaps you could say.
Yeah.
As I said before, I think the unity on Russia has been quite stunning on the war, and in many ways on other foreign policy issues, just as how the relationship with China. Last year, there was a 16+1 summit. First of all, one country left, as you say, but 6 leaders did not attend, including old friends of China, like Romania, Bulgaria. Having worked a little bit on Romania, for example, I can tell you that this may be an old friend of China, but the young generation feels much closer to the West and to the United States and to the EU, and is very, very proud to be part of the EU, and very much goes along the EU policy. And by the way, this reminds me something about the last Friday's summit. I think the European Commission president was very keen to remind China as well that the Sino-Russian trade per day is $2 million, is it? While the EU-China trade is like 300 million euro a day.
On a daily basis.
On a daily basis. So never forget that, a population of 1.4 billion Chinese to feed, as the Chinese Communist Party is very good at repeating. This is key priority.
Yeah.
Sticking together, getting this society to work. And geopolitical issues come second. This is the year of the 20th Party Congress in the fall, where Mr. Xi is running for a third term. Honestly, I think the economic and the trade situation will be the most deciding factor when it comes to and the relationship with Europe is important, just because it doesn't look very good on the US front and the US-China front.
Ahead of that summit or Party Congress in November, President Xi has a lot on his plate to first clarify ahead of his re-election. Paul, we talked a lot about land-based routes and the BRI, how it is impaired, impacted. What about maritime routes? We're here in Greece. One of the major connectivity links is the port in Piraeus. We also have Chinese investment in the context of the BRI in Turkey, Kumport. Do you anticipate that there is a sense of replacement, that from land-based we're going to have much more maritime-based traffic, and that means that ports in Greece, in Turkey, of which China is a major shareholder, just increase in value and in traffic, and hence also in political significance?
I certainly see that as certainly very likely. What we're seeing is, if you look at the other alternate routes for land-based transport, none of them are great. You have the China-Pakistan. I don't think I need to sort of talk about the complexities of that. You can go from Central Asia through Iran, again, very complex with the United States, or you can go across the Caspian Sea, but that's shipping, and then through the Caucasus, but we have Armenia, Azerbaijan, we have Georgia, which is in a dispute, and then you get to the Black Sea, and you have all of those issues in the Black Sea. So I do think, Piraeus is going to be, there's going to be a lot more focus in. We're going to see a lot of sort of a reworking of some of those trade routes.
Yes.
But that doesn't necessarily help China in 100 ways, because China wanted to sort of reduce some of that reliance on maritime. And what we're seeing is that because of what's happening in Russia and because of the other tensions in the broader region, some of which, in the Caucasus, Russia is, and throughout the Black Sea, Russia is complicating things for China. We are seeing Chinese might want to move elsewhere, but they still have all of the other problems, blockages in the Suez, fears about the U.S. Maritime superiority, and then, as Philippe started, we still have COVID out there, and maritime is only as good as you have people who can put stuff on at the ports in China and also take them off. And what we've seen throughout the world is we've seen supply chain backups not only at the factory level, but in the ports of departure ports, but also backups in the arrival ports in Europe and North America, simply because of COVID, and you don't have the workers or the ability to take stuff off. So this is a real big issue, and I don't think there's a clear. We might be out of the worst of COVID, but Shanghai says we're not quite, and the fact that all of us today had to show our COVID vaccination card just to get here means we're not out of it. And so this, we have both the geopolitical tensions of the world, and then we have the pandemic that's still with us.
And if I can just say a few words about Greece, because I know time is running out, but I think Costco increased its share, of course, last year after a long debate, which wasn't a foregone conclusion, as I understand. And I think the Greek Prime Minister was also, interestingly said that Greece is not particularly dependent on Chinese investments. So there is a major investment in the ports, and there are other investments around the region as well. But Greece has been very good at following the EU line vis-à-vis China, particularly the defense mechanisms, the screening of foreign direct investments, and so on. So I think there's give and take, and Greece is very much part of the sort of the global policy on China. Having said that, I mean, Piraeus has been a fairly successful harbor and will probably benefit from the situation. But I don't think China should take Greece for granted. It's actually, I mean, you probably know more than I do about this. But I can see that a lot of projects that were meant to happen did not happen.
And I would say that's not just Greece, that's the BRI as a whole. So you see many countries that thought they were going to get a lot more out of the BRI and they haven't.
Indeed. I think that's a good closing statement. I won't say anything more. I'd like to say thank you to Paul and to Philippe. I'd like to say thank you to you for your patience, for listening.
Thank you all.